Welcome back to another episode of the D-League. Today, episode 24, and it's gonna be the last week that Bilal and we will be talking about genre. And to close out the genre season of podcasts, today we're going to talk about a very classic genre of video games, which are platformers. And probably everyone has played a platformer in his or her life. And what a platformer basically is that you control a character and you are moving along a level to reach the end of the level. And mostly you do that by jumping over hazards like pits or enemies. And platformers can be either 2D or 3D, and that changes your capabilities of movement. For example, if you have a 2D platformer, which pretty much means you move in a line, let's say from left to right, and you can only go left to right and maybe jump, so you just move upwards. But if it's a 3D platformer, then if you have a hole in the ground or a pit, it's got to be a circle, so you can just walk around it. And so in that case, in a 2D platformer, you would have to jump because you cannot avoid the pit. But in a 3D platformer, you can just walk around it, maybe. And concerning platformers, they mostly use different styled levels. So as you progress in the game, you also change level styles, and they also might include power-ups to keep the gameplay fresh and to keep it from getting stale. I mean, if you play 100 levels of, the same platforming, it might be boring after 20 levels, and you are looking forward to the end. And, then concerning mobile platforms, you also have platformers that are on rails, which means that the character moves on its own, and you just, for example, tap the screen to jump over pits. So it's kind of on rails because you just enjoy the ride and jump to not die. So Bilal, I guess that's you. I guess you have nothing to add to the general system of a platformer, right?
No, that would be it.
All right, then Bilal, as a player, I mean, platformers are so kind of iconic with series like Super Mario Brothers or Donkey Kong Country. As a player, what do you think would you kind of expect a platformer to be like? Would it just be for example, Super Mario knockoff, or how would you expect something different from a platformer?
For the typical kind of platformer that I expect, I think most people, and me as well, will have a subconscious reaction to think about like Super Mario Brothers, because it was pretty much like the most iconic platformer. It's kind of where the genre came from, I think, unless I'm making that up. I'm not sure. But I expect it kind of depends on the timeline, because when I think platformer, I think jump and move left and right in a 2D kind of thing. But then you also have the 3D ones, which kind of came in like the really early 2000s kind of era. And then you have, modern day platformers, because indie developers are a much bigger thing now. I kind of expect a game with those jumping controls, like I said before, but then they typically have something a lot more interesting added onto it, unless it's just a basic one that doesn't really get recognized. But I'd say most of the like popular modern ones nowadays, I expect some either like really good graphics or I don't know, a jetpack feature or some sort of like fighting, so some special mechanic anyway.
Okay, I see. So I kind of split up the platformer genre as a player into 4 parts, which is design, gameplay, story, and difficulty.
Mm-hmm.
Because for me, I think that platformers have something like a different reason why you play it. For example, let's say as a design, you might have a cute character that you like. So, for example, you have something like Kirby, and where you just say, "Oh, yeah, that's cute. I want to check out that game. I want to play Kirby."
Mm-hmm.
And so that's kind of a motivation to play that specific platformer, maybe. Or you can also have something dark, like a darker theme. I mean, if you take a look at Super Meat Boy, for example, you are a piece of meat jumping around, and you leave a trail of blood, and you fall into sauce, and then you get minced meat, or you become minced meat, stuff like that. I mean, that's much darker, right?
Yeah.
So I think the design is something that as a player you might be interested in, and which also is, I think, very important to the overall experience. I noted down 2 examples, which would be, for example, Donkey Kong Country, where you just have this theme of monkey in a jungle, or like in very natural environments, and so you just maybe like rolling around as a monkey as a player. At least the games, for me, the games were very good, and it, from the design perspective, it just fit. It was not too challenging. For example, with the difficulty, the story was meh, and so it was more the design and gameplay that made you kind of addicted to the game. Another example would be the Shantae series, where, well, you are a pretty attractive half genie running around whipping demon pirates, or like your hometown is under attack. That's kind of the story, and you want to protect it. So it's kind of generic overall, with some added twists. So I guess in that case it's more about the character design. Like, you just like the character Shantae and the different morphs that you can use. So like in that case, I would say why you would play Donkey Kong Country or Shantae is more the design that pulls you in, and then the gameplay that makes you addicted to those games.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I wouldn't know. I haven't actually tried either of those. So
okay, and yeah, concerning gameplay, I think that's kind of easy and difficult to say, but for gameplay, most platformers start with kind of tutorial levels, right? So it's not like you get thrown into the most difficult levels right away.
Mm-hmm.
But as you proceed through the game, the gameplay changes through power-ups, for example, and then levels get more complex as well. And so in that case, you start the game and you learn the basics, and then you learn new stuff, or you get new power-ups and you learn new stuff, and so that kind of keeps it fresh.
Yeah.
I must say, for example, a game like the first Super Mario Brothers, which was, I wouldn't say, maybe it was revolutionary at that time. I mean, it was an arcade game first, and it kind of made video games popular with the casual crowd. But like, if you don't use warps, then it's like you're playing the same game for 40 levels, just with a bit different design, and it's always like walking from left to right, sometimes the same environment. And yeah, so from a today's perspective, you would say, okay, it gets stale too fast, I think.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, that's why, I mean, platformers have such simple gameplay that, like, in my opinion, that I think what really makes one special or fun to play now after so many exist, and it's like such a classic genre. I think what makes it interesting is like the different features in each one that, you know, like a special mechanic or very different levels, that kind of thing.
Yeah, I think so as well. I mean, even if you take a look at the Super Mario series, then you had Super Mario 64 with 3D gameplay instead of 2D. And then you had Super Mario Sunshine, which was all about this water gun to clean the city or defeat enemies that you could use as a jetpack. And like, even Nintendo changed the gameplay dramatically in the Super Mario series, because you cannot release the same game for 30 years and expect people to buy it just for better graphics or maybe a bit different physics. Because, why would you buy it if you have like the previous version already and you could just play that again?
Yeah. And I mean, on that point, like, I sometimes don't give Mario, like, I guess, the credit it deserves, because I mean, when I think like harder about it, I mean, Super Mario Sunshine is like one of the best games on the GameCube, and I think Super Mario Galaxy was, I haven't played the second one, but the first one was actually very fun, and it had very interesting art. It kind of felt like a bit distant from like Mario kind of story. Like, it was a little bit strange in how it tried to be a little bit surreal. But I mean, it was a fun game nonetheless. Like when I say surreal, I mean like when they tried to bring in characters from, say, like Mario 64, you know, Bullet Bill and Mario and all. I mean, Mario was exactly the same, but I guess some of the NPCs felt a little bit strange being in space where they have all these glowy effects, and it was kind of a more it kind of gave a more vote effect of you actually being in danger, or like the world being in danger, rather than just Mario trying to save the princess. But yeah, kind of that was more of a story point, but overall it was like a very interesting game with its planet mechanic where you would switch between planets that you could completely run around. So and you'd have like a gravitic pull to whichever one you're running on top of. So you could go on any point of the sphere that the planet was supposed to be. And that was visually cool, and it was very interesting to play. And I mean, I can see it translating as a gimmick to some people, because it is. I mean, at times it can feel like a gimmick, but it was cool that they tried something that's special to see in like a platformer genre.
Yeah, I think that you just have to switch it up a bit, and as a developer today, you cannot just take a look at a platformer and copy it one like completely, just with a different design, because people won't buy it then. You need to have something special.
Yeah.
In that case as well. And like you talked about story, and for me, this you might have some games that that make you want to play this game because of the story, but most of the time platformers are pretty slim on story. Like even the classics in Super Mario, it's okay, princess gets kidnapped by Bowser and you have to rescue her. And in Donkey Kong Country, it's your bananas get stolen and you have to retrieve them. And that's why you want to beat the end boss to get back your bananas. I mean, in the later part, in the later, like in Donkey Kong Country 2 and 3, a character also gets kidnapped. So it's kind of the same thing as in Super Mario, where you just want to rescue somebody. And that's, I mean, you beat bosses, but you don't get any story progression, for example. It's just like in Super Mario, yeah, your princess is in another castle. Or in Donkey Kong Country, yeah, you just beat those and unlock a new area to get to the final boss. And for me, one game that I actually enjoyed was a more recent platformer, which is 1001 Spikes, where the game actually gives you a reason why like the environments change. For example, like the story is you get a letter from your family and you have to look for your father and who is out on an adventure, and you are an adventurer yourself. So it's like son trying to rescue his father, and then as you progress, you find more and more items of your father, and so of course it's not the main point, but in the end you still don't know will you find your father, because if you, for example, find his bag or his map or something else from him, then you think, okay, he lost that and that's important. Is he like actually dead or something like this? And so it also has like smaller cutscenes and with an ending, like a well, not very animated, so it's more like still pictures with text. But I actually liked that reason. It's kind of the same save somebody trope, but it's not, okay, bad guy is has kidnapped your father thing, but he went on an adventure and hasn't returned, and so you try to save that guy. So like the reason is a bit different. Yeah. So is there like any platformer where you would say, as a player, you actually like the story, or if there is none, what would you like the story to be?
You know, maybe I'm playing favorites here, but I think one of the Kirby games, definitely not Superstar Ultra, because that one has pretty much no real story. But I think one of the older ones, like for Advance or Game Boy Advance, like which one? I think Amazing Mirror had the most interesting story, because it was obscure. And I can't remember completely what happened, but I know that there's some like mystery villain, right, who you don't really know who did this to Kirby, where he split him into 4 different Kirbys that, you know, all can do a different thing. which was amazing at the time because you could play with friends on like Game Boy Advance, right? where co-op was not really a thing at the time. Um, but the story was pretty cool because at the beginning, like something slashes Kirby, he gets put into four guys, and you're like trying to figure out what happened wrong, and you go through all these different mirrors as portals to progress and figure out like what happened. So it's a very like vague story because Nintendo games, they're, especially back then, there's just no voice at all. There's not really any text. It's kind of you kind of assume like what's going on. Though it typically is clear through like Kirby's facial emotion or facial animations and whatnot. But yeah, I mean for how subtle it was, it communicates like a pretty interesting story, I think, at least for a game that's kind of simple like back then.
Yeah, I think another example that comes to mind for me is VVVVV, where where you like this teleporter goes bonkers, and then your crew split up, and so yeah, okay, it's not it's not that complex, but at least like you can, when you find a crew member, then you have some dialogue, and then you go back to the starting point. So you actually have some interaction, and you find out some more clues what happened, and stuff like that. And yeah, I think that it's really strange, right? Like platformers always come kind of back to this save somebody storyline, or maybe save the world storyline, like in Crash Bandicoot, for example, where what is it? Cortex is trying to take over the world, and then you're Crash Bandicoot, that you just want to stop him to save the world, kind of thing.
Yeah. So I mean, I think actually in the case of 5Vs, 6Vs, I don't know how many Vs.
It's 6, I think.
In the case of that game, I watched a video partial of it, like briefly, like a few minutes of it, and I think from like what I understood, it was supposed to be very simple, but like not simple mechanics, but like simple story, but it was supposed to be like emotional at the same time, right? Something from what I understood, but yeah, they tend. I think it's because the mechanics are simple, so people tend to go for a more kind of simple story. They don't try to get like too complicated with it. So
I guess it's also very difficult to actually tell a story in game, because the gameplay, like you said, in a 2D platformer, it's going from left to right, or like on a 2D plane, going somewhere, and there has to be some end. And in Mario, it's the flag, or in Donkey Kong Country, it's also what is it? It's I think it was also a flag in Donkey Kong Country 2. And so, like, how do you tell a story in the game without interrupting it too much? So you could do it at the end of the level, but then it's just a cutscene, or maybe a picture, or just some text, or something like that. But if it's in game, then it might be too interrupting from the gameplay, and even then, you cannot have every enemy tell you something about the story. So it's probably just bosses. So it would still be 5, 6, 7 levels until you get something new in the story.
In the case of Super Mario Sunshine, I think they did a pretty good job of it. The story was silly, but it was not as generic as I think, like all the other Marios, pretty much, right? Because well, I don't know about Galaxy or the new ones. I haven't played Galaxy 2 or anything after that. In Galaxy 1, I mean, it was anyway. Sunshine, like it had cutscenes and all other characters that Mario would talk. Like Mario would kind of respond with like noises. Exactly. Yeah, and like facial whatever you call them, expressions. There we go. But they had, I mean, like there would be different cutscenes. So like you'd kill one boss, and as you progressed on, the bosses would be more like, or I guess the story would be more revealed. I think it was not really revealed. Yeah, you could also, there was also dialogue. You could talk to guys and they'd tell you one thing, but for the most part, the story wasn't really like revealed until the ending, like the final boss where you fight Bowser, because his careful spoilers from like 2001 or something. the boss, Bowser's son, like Bowser Jr., thinks that Peach is his mom, so he's like is trying to steal her back anyway. So it's a little more complicated than just Monster wants to own Peach as a slave, but I don't know. Anyway, it also had like cutscenes, so it was kind of a more complex platformer, but it also had kind of a more complex storyline, which, you know, it's kind of a, and I think that's kind of a trend you see with a lot of platformers. I mean, the 2D ones kind of have a light story, then the 3D ones are kind of more into it, I think.
You mean like the recent Batman games? I mean, those are kind of platformer-ish, right?
Oh, I don't know anything about them. I thought they were like combat and platformer, right? Not sure.
Yeah, so, yeah, I mean, where do you kind of draw the line?
Yeah.
I mean, in the Batman games, you can kind of fly around the city, and it's about fighting villains. So, I mean, even in the past, when you had older superhero games, it's kind of fighting the villain thing again, right? You just, today, like you said, it's just that maybe you have more possibilities to kind of present the story.
Yeah.
Where you meet the villain, but he can escape, or maybe it was just a hoax. He didn't want to bomb the dam, but he just made you think that to kidnap somebody, or leave some hint, or stuff like that.
Yeah.
Yeah. So maybe, I guess, as a player, maybe it would be interesting to have a game, or for me, I would like to see a game that is very heavy on story, but not just be quick time events for 4 hours straight, or just on rails, like auto scrollers.
Yeah.
Oof. Yeah. Anyway, let's move on from the story. I mean, everyone that listens to our podcast probably knows some platformers and the story, or they don't remember the story because it was so unimportant.
Yeah.
And let's move on. And I want to quickly talk about the last point that I noted down for platformers, which is the difficulty. And not very recently, but at some point in time, you just have platformers be released, or maybe some indie guy created a platformer and just put it online for download, where the main appeal is the difficulty, where it's, as a player, the reason why you boot up the game is to be challenged by the game. I guess a famous example is I Want to Be the Guy, and there are several Japanese similar games from Japan which are just there to troll you and like make you frustrated. So I guess that's kind of for a masochist in this case, where, for example, you walk around and then there's a tree with apples, and then suddenly one apple starts to home in on you or just fall down on you very quickly, and you need to know that it's coming to actually dodge it. So it's like one reason to the only reason to play that game is to see how much of an asshole the developer can be. Where even as a player you get surprised by like the ground collapsing and there are spikes, or you have a big monster popping out of the end of the screen like once or twice, and then there's a long pause and you think, okay, now I can go to the next screen, and then it pops out the third time. Things like that, and then you're just like laughing at yourself because you got trolled, kind of.
Yeah.
And I mean, I think there are just kind of games like that. Also something like Super Meat Boy, which is not there to kind of troll you, but which is just very challenging to platform. And that is, I think, a reason for experienced players to play a new platformer. If you know how to play platformers, okay, you can jump from platform to platform or over pits, and then it gets kind of boring at some point. Even if you play a new game, if you're good at it, then you just beat it easily, right? You just progress because the game was made for less experienced players, and that is kind of the niche as a player where you say, okay, I know what you're getting. I know what I'm getting into. It's just for me to have a challenge in this genre that I know so well. I don't know if you actually kind of agree with that. If you say, okay, difficulty is one point why you play a game.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely. This is a hard one for me. I think difficulty is definitely a highlight in games. It's an interesting concept because, I mean, sometimes the difficulty can be considered bad design. To avoid going too far off topic, I just want to say quickly, if you look at Skyrim, for example, the difficulty slider in Skyrim is bad. Skyrim's a great game, but the difficulty slider is basically revving up numbers or revving down numbers rather than actually designing the game differently depending on a difficulty. And so yeah, I mean, platformers typically have one difficulty. So I think whichever difficulty they choose is, I guess, a little bit more important than something like an FPS. And it really needs the game to be completely designed around it. Because like you're talking about with these masochist games, I don't like them, period. Super Meat Boy, I think I find these kinds of games frustrating. But I'm saying I don't like them as a player. I wouldn't play them, but I can appreciate if people like that sort of thing, or if they're designed well. So I mean, I think I do agree that difficulty is one of the main points of a platformer. But yeah, I think it's very polarizing.
Yeah, like you say, you don't like the difficulty of Super Meat Boy, for example. Then the game was just not, let's say, made for you.
Mm-hmm.
But I mean, you don't play platformers much anyway, right?
Yeah, it's been quite a while since the last one.
Yeah. So, I guess games like that are just made for people that enjoy the genre. Like we enjoy strategy games, or we maybe enjoy first-person shooters, and for platformers, either you have a new mechanics where you say, okay, it plays completely different as a platformer, or well, like you have those Super Mario hacks where they take Super Mario World or some other Mario game and then make it extra difficult. So like you have the same enemies, you have the same mechanics, you have the same power ups. So it's kind of, you could say it's the same game, just that the level design changed, and the level design was made to just make you angry, or where you have to do very, very difficult tricks that you have to know that you have to use at this point in the game to advance. And so it's just, I think, platforming games that focus on difficulty are just made for these platform lovers, let's say, where
like enthusiasts.
Maybe they love Super Mario World, and okay, so you completed the game in all levels for hundreds and thousands of times, and then you just boot up that hack and it's super difficult, and you just get kind of pulled into this way of thinking where you say, oh, I know how to play the game, but I cannot finish the level. I want to finish it. At least that was kind of the case for me with 1001 Spikes as well, which is not that easy. Like the first levels are kind of easy, makes you get used to the controls and the stuff you can do in the game, and then it just ramps up the difficulty where you have puzzles you need to figure out, like platforms are falling down and when you touch them, and so you have to jump back and forth between platforms, for example. And I can understand that others might get frustrated by it and say, yeah, fuck this game, I died 200 times in that level and couldn't do it. I give up. But then for me, I just enjoyed the challenge in this case, as well as the design of the game. Like I like the look, so just couldn't stop, or I tried to finish a level for several hours, and then I said, yeah, okay, I'm gonna do it tomorrow. And then the day after, it worked, and I finished the level. But then you have the next level, and then you have this same situation where you have to adjust again, learn the timings, and I guess in this case, it's more like playing a rhythm game, you could say. I mean, if you play something like Guitar Hero or Beatmania, it's about knowing which button you have to press, for example, in Beatmania, or in Guitar Hero, like where you have to while you're also pressing buttons, but which notes you have to hit, and they come in so quick succession that it, as a beginner, you won't get it perfect. You won't be able to finish the song perfectly, but as a player, you might have this drive to finish it perfectly, or to just be actually able to finish the difficult songs in the game. And I think it's the same thing with platformers, where to finish the level you have to press the buttons at the correct time, right?
Yeah.
But then you have easier, like you have easier songs in Guitar Hero, you have easier levels in platformers. and it also gets more difficult than if you have to hit one note every 5 seconds in Guitar Hero, then it's boring. But if you're experienced, it's good for beginners to get into like playing the game.
Yeah.
But as an experienced player, you want to hit like 100 notes in 2 seconds or something.
Yeah.
Is there like that? Those are my notes for the player perspective for platformers. Is there anything you would like to add or talk about from a player perspective?
In terms of like fundamental like concepts, no. But I would like to say that I think the general flow of a platformer, in terms of like going between every level, like they typically a level should either let you use something you've learned before in a new way or in a new challenging way. So it should provide some sort of challenge or innovation with each level after you've learned something, or the level should teach you, or the level should teach you some new mechanic to use in the future. So for a quick example, I think Kirby games are a really good example for this because you would be able to switch to any kind of different power. So for example, it would before you were to do something, it would show you, okay, there's a guy here that gives you this ability. If you swallow him and eat him, and then try using your ability in like the next place, then you'll figure out how it works. So for example, if there's a stone guy walking around next to a pit and there's like nowhere else to go in the pit, then swallow the stone guy and hit the only action button and fall into the pit and end up killing some guys while you're falling. So that might show you like what the stone ability does, for example.
Yeah, or I think in some Kirby games you had to light cannons with a fire ability, or maybe press a switch with like the stone ability, stuff like that.
Yeah.
So yeah, I guess that's a good thing to implement.
Yeah, and then in the future, you'd have like several different options in a level, like to swallow guys before, and then you could go ahead and use those. But there was also the concept of if you were an advanced player and you wanted to do just whatever, you could swallow 2 guys, get a random ability, and then if it ends up being good, well, then you have some edge of what to do next in that place if you get creative.
Implying you don't just want to have the UFO power.
I remember that. That was fun.
All right. So that's it for you from the player perspective as well?
Yes.
All right. Then I guess we don't have to talk about examples right now.
Yeah.
Okay. We talked about so many different platformers already, and there are actually so many out there. Because it's, like we said, it's just such a classic genre.
Yeah.
And let's talk about creating a platformer game as a developer. Let me start real quick. Like my main point would be that as a developer, you would have to pick a focus first.
Mm-hmm.
So like I said, design, gameplay, story, difficulty, at least for me. Because if you say, okay, I want to make a difficult game, then you must make the game fun for experienced players. But if you pick a focus of, let's say, a story, if you can do that, then you don't want the game to be too difficult, because people would quit at some point and then actually don't, because they are not able to progress in the story. And like if you focus on gameplay, then you want maybe many different abilities. So you might not have the most, let's say, varying enemies.
Yeah.
But you just give the player new ways to beat them, or to progress through a level, and or maybe just focus rather on the design, where you make the player fall in love with the world that you are creating, where you have maybe a very dark world or dark characters. Maybe you are actually the villain in a game, and that where you just have a design that's very special, and maybe not just hero walking around beating bad guys, something like that. And so when you pick a focus, you of course you actually want to be good at everything, right? I mean, that would be the best game, where you say the design is awesome, the gameplay is awesome, and there's a story that keeps you want to play the game, and it has a right difficulty for everyone. But you probably don't have the time to do everything, right? So some things like the focus will also influence the other points. Like if you want to make a very difficult game, then story people probably don't really care about, because just experienced players will be able to finish it. But the gameplay is probably important, where because you will create difficulty by gameplay design. And like I Want to Be the Guy has a very generic, it's just stolen assets from other games, like Mike Tyson or Ryu from Street Fighter. So it just throws stuff at you. So the design is kind of nothing special. It's all about the gameplay and the difficulty. While maybe Mario or Kirby, they have their focus rather on design and gameplay, because the design makes the game attractive to children as well. Like you have this cute Kirby or the fat Mario guy. And
very colorful.
And then they just like to they like the character first, and then they like the gameplay as they get used to it.
That's a pretty common thing.
I
was just gonna say, I totally agree with the focus point, because if you look at like the modern platformers today, like they definitely get recognized for these things they're kind of archetypes in a way for each of these fundamentals that we kind of laid out. I mean, if you say, Super Meat Boy is definitely a difficulty game. People think Super Meat Boy, they think that game is hard. If you think like Braid, Braid is definitely a gameplay focus. People were focused on the kind of time effect of it and how that was really creative and something interesting to try to play through. You can kind of argue. I haven't actually played Ori and the Blind Forest at all, but you could argue either design or story, because it was supposed to be very sad, but at the same time, if you just take one look at like a video of the game, like the visuals are absolutely stunning, and it's just a 2D game. It's not like it's some crazy 3D CG, realistic thing, but it's 2D and it has very amazing visuals that they all fit together, and it's all very smooth and good looking. So, the platformers that do exist now are recognized by one of these features for the most part, and the rest of them tend to complement them, in my opinion. So, I think it is actually very important to first pick a focus and determine what it is you want your game to communicate or do for the player.
That becomes your selling point, right? So, if you have a very mediocre game in every aspect, then people don't care. But if you, like you say, Ori and the Blind Forest has this great visual design where people might just pick up the game because they like this design, and I think it's the same for other games as well. Like Super Meat Boy, people buy it to play a difficult game.
Yeah.
If it was easy, then they would probably say, yeah, boring. So I have just 2 more notes where it's more gameplay oriented, and that is that for a platformer, as a developer, you must platforming make sense from like physics point of view. I think where, for example, you jump and you see your character being on the platform, but then suddenly you fall through because like the let's say if you use boxes where your character is and where the platform starts, so you have like a visual that looks like you are actually jumping on the platform, but that's not where this box, this ground box actually is. So you fall through the edge, and that's very frustrating.
Yeah.
And I know that some older games had that problem where it looked like, yeah, you're gonna reach. You're gonna reach, it's gonna be very tight, but you are going to reach that platform. And then you just fall through the edge of the platform. And yeah, it's so frustrating, or as a player, you kind of feel cheated. Or at least that was my my feeling when that happened, where you just say, okay, it looked like I did it, but the game just made me fall into the pit.
Yeah.
So I think that's one thing where you want the visuals to represent the kind of the gameplay as well. If you have a platform and there's a visual, then make the whole visual be the platform instead of, let's say you have some grass, like the edges are very grassy, then yeah, make the grass the platform as well, instead of just some visuals where the player would still fall through with his character.
Yeah, and you can, and there's a difference between like a masochist game and a poorly designed game. So even if it's a masochist game, and like you would not want to make the visuals be unclear at communicating like the actual gameplay.
Yeah, exactly. Else, well, I guess when you create the platformer, then of course you have to pay attention to level design, that it's actually possible to complete the level. But I guess as a dev, you will create a map or a level and then test it before saying, okay, this product is finished. It's like saying, okay, you play Super Mario, and then you have a platform at the beginning, and then a huge hole, and then the flag at the end. So yeah, you won't be able to make that. So you have to kind of actually test that everything is possible, or how difficult it is. I know some games where you had to really stand on the edge of a pit, and then jump and press right at the same time, so you were actually able to make the jump. So it was very let's say distance specific. So maybe some more leniency is preferable, I guess. Guess it's the same feeling cheated thing, where you think, oh yeah, I just have to jump, and then it's very specific, stand on the edge, or maybe you need to even have some velocity. If you have something like a run mechanic where you build up speed. And so as a dev, don't make it too frustrating for the player, I guess.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
And another point for me would be just something more visual, which would be if you jump a lot, let's say, then maybe have different animations for jumping. Like I think even the newer Mario games, they have this jumping with left foot, jumping with right foot, or like spinning in the air, like making a flip, something like that.
Yeah.
For maybe different speeds, or maybe just make it random, where it doesn't really change anything, just looks a bit different. Just do it. If you jump around for 3 or 4 hours in the game and it looks completely the same, and I guess it depends if it's a slow-paced or a fast-paced game. If you actually notice the animation more or less, just mix it up a bit.
It can depend on what the game is. I mean, if you look at it and your character looks, and you're noticing the character is stale, then I would say you definitely want to go for more than one. But I mean, if you can go, I would recommend going for 2 in the first place anyway. Like minimum.
Yeah. I guess in that case you just check, okay, is the character like walking or running, is like full speed or not?
Yeah.
You have enough reasons to use different animations, I think.
Yeah. Okay, so I guess should I talk about more technical stuff and marketing stuff, or?
Yes, please.
Okay, sure. So, I mean, we kind of just like made it redundant, but I mean, it's definitely viable to make a platformer. I mean, it's one of the easiest genres to physically make. It just takes, with that said, like, you obviously are going to be working on it for hours, tweaking maps and creating assets and all that. But it's fundamentally not as hard as like many others. I mean, you need to work on like simple gameplay with some innovative mechanics nowadays, because you're not just going to make Mario Brothers and then have it be fun, right? I mean, if you just make a clone, it's boring. So don't make a clone, but do make a platformer. And you need to ensure that your jumping is, perfect. Like it's called a platformer because of jumping. So if your jump mechanic is bad, then there's no reason to play it. So your jumping needs to be tweaked exactly how you want it to be. You don't just settle for something like a sine function or applying some random amount of force upward. You want to make sure that it works perfectly with your map design so that it feels balanced and smooth. And the same thing with speed. I mean, like, for example, maybe if you run for a long distance, you start running faster. Mechanics like this should be taken into account if you want whatever it is your game to be in, like tweaked for your maps and gameplay. So that said, I mean, in terms of like more technical stuff, if you're going to hop in and make one now, I mean, I don't make platformers really, so I can recommend. Unity has an asset called Corgi Engine, which is supposed to have it's supposed to be very popular, and it's a platformer engine, which works with 2D or 2.5D, I think. So if you want to make a platformer fast, then that's something to consider. Remember to always take tools into account before you start working on something, so you don't reinvent the wheel without purpose. And yeah, I mean, other alternatives is you could kind of use any 2D game engine. Game Maker is probably the first choice I'd use for a 2D game engine. I don't really know if there are great frameworks for platformer, but I would say just do your research and you'll definitely find whichever one's best for you, as long as you put in the time to actually check which engines make platformers easier. So yeah, that's all the technical stuff I have to say.
I think, like, I agree that it makes sense to make a platformer, but to make a successful platformer today, I think you need to invest some creativity to make it special, and that might be difficult. So maybe if you're not the most creative guy, then maybe it's not the best. I think it might be a good start for game deving, where you just say, okay, I'm gonna make a basic platformer, and just so you can test stuff, how to program things, how make collisions work, and so I think it's good entry genre, maybe, where you as you learn more and more, that you can just start build on your experience and start doing more advanced things.
Yeah, and there, I mean, if you look at any of the award-winning ones, they all have, something special about them. Like Ori and the Blind Forest is very special. Braid's special. All the new ones are very special if people know their names. And I mean, it's pretty common with games in general. You typically tend to go big or go home, but I mean, you can be somewhere in the middle as long as you make something creative enough.
Exactly. All right, then I guess that wraps it up for this week. Next week we won't be talking about genre. We will be talking about a different topic. We'll surprise you in our next podcast then. I guess any final comments from you, Bilal?
Nope.
All right, I don't have any either. So thank you very much for listening this week, and I hope you will be listening again next week. If you have any comments concerning platformers, maybe something you like, maybe something you don't like, or maybe your favorite platformer, then feel free to share. And that's it for this week, and see you next week. Bye bye, guys.
Bye bye.